So, continuing our series, we're on Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. So typically with this beatitude, when it's studied, preached, discussed, righteousness is kind of believed to refer to like our personal ethics. It's more kind of on us that we hunger for, righteous behavior. In fact, today's English version of the Bible translates the verse, "Happy are those whose greatest desire is to do what God requires." There is much to be said in favor of this understanding because Matthew's gospel does place heavy emphasis on personal righteousness. But there are reasons why this might not be the best way to understand this verse. And so, because you often hear it the other way, we'll kind of dig into this way. With a lot of things, I think it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and. We should hunger and thirst after what God requires. We should hunger and thirst for righteousness, being how do we live in right relationship with each other. Righteousness is never a complete personal thing. It's how we're in relationship with others. But there's another side of it too I think is worth looking at. So first, it seems a bit presumptuous to understand this beatitude as promising perfect righteousness to those who work hard at achieving it, or that God will satisfy them fully. Second, the metaphors of hungering and thirsting seem more apt with reference to a righteousness that is not subject to our willing and doing, but more the righteousness of God. We should think of God's saving righteousness as proclaimed by the prophets of the Old Testament. So once again, a window into a good interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount comes from the Hebrew Scriptures. Just like we've kind of talked about in past verses, often you can understand best what Jesus is saying by understanding the Hebrew Scriptures. Too often we try to read the Hebrew Scriptures just in light of the New Testament. We should really be reading the New Testament in light of the Old Testament, because often what Jesus is saying has its roots in the Hebrew Scriptures. And when he's talking, people so well knew the Hebrew Scriptures, he could reference little things because it was just in the air. So if I said, every time a bell rings, what do you say? Exactly, you know it well. It's just you know the movie, you know some of these classic Christmas lines. So it's the same thing they had with the Hebrew Scriptures. They knew it so well that Jesus could make references and be able to point back, that's in Isaiah, that's in Exodus. It's there. So we've talked a lot about how a lot of these Beatitudes have kind of some roots in the book of Isaiah. Same thing here. It says, "My righteousness," or deliverance in the RSV, "draws near speedily, my salvation has gone forth." Isaiah 51:1 can be understood in the same way. "Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. It is not their own righteousness that is the object of their yearning, but God's righteousness." So if this is the correct way to understand the verse, "Blessed are those who yearn for the manifestation of God's saving righteousness," the distance between Luke's version and Matthew's is greatly diminished. So in the Lucan parallel, it's clear that the beatitude, like the first in Luke's, refers to those who are literally hungry. The corresponding woe promises the welfare that they will exchange places with the undernourished. The Lucan beatitudes are very similar to the song Mary sings after visiting Elizabeth in the Nativity story. The passage typically referred to as the Magnificat, where she says, God will send the rich away empty, fill the hungry with good things. Throughout Luke, there's kind of these reversals. First will be last will be first. Rich will be sent away empty, hungry filled with good things. So if we consider that Matthew and Luke are both concerned with this idea of social justice and try to get out the political social justice term, more the idea of justice in the ways we live in the society, then we might render the verse like the NEB translation does. "How blessed are those who hunger and thirst to see right prevail, for they shall be satisfied." How blessed are those who hunger and thirst to see just righteousness, right relationships be the norm, that everybody is living in the right ways. We talked about it in today's sermon with, Jesus being the pattern, how we're supposed to live our days. We're hungry and thirsty for that kind of thing to be on earth, for God's kind of way to be the way, to see it lived out. So among those who long for God to set things right are both those themselves who themselves suffer hunger pains, and those who also mourn over the inequitable distribution of goods and services that allows millions to starve on a planet capable of providing food sufficient for all. We talked about with the other beatitude, blessed are those who mourn. It's not just about mourning death. It's blessed are those who mourn the problems of the world. Like when you see things happening, you see war, you see innocent people being killed, you see another mass shooting, you see starving people, you mourn for that. If we don't mourn for that, something's wrong with us. We should see the world and say, this is not how it should be. It should break our heart as it breaks God's heart. So you see kind of a parallel. Blessed are those who mourn for this, but also blessed are those who hunger and thirst for the right way to live, to finally be lived, not just by you, but by all, who hunger and thirst for God's righteousness to come down. So those who long to see God's righteousness, deliverance, justice prevail will indeed be satisfied, because God's promises find fulfillment. And the promises God makes throughout Scripture to turn the world upside down, fill up the hungry, free the captives, care for the poor, will be no different. So ultimately, when you hunger for that way, for God's justice, you will be satisfied, because one day, God's promised day, God's justice and God's righteousness will reign. Questions, comments, joyous remarks? Yes, Pam.
I'm just thinking, and this may just be 20th century thinking, that at this time, was this kind of talk considered seditious?
Could be. I mean, you think about how you can turn almost anything political these days. You can talk about health care and caring people, make sure they get what they need. It can quickly become a political statement, even if you don't necessarily mean it that way. So if you're talking about a reversal of fortunes, and the Bible talks a lot about that, if you're the ones in power and somebody has a big following talking about reversals all the time, God will tear every tyrant from his throne. If you're the ones on the throne, you're going to hear that as sedition probably. Whoa, wait a minute here. We don't like that. Or if you're one of the rich, sending the rich away empty, you talking about a overthrow, a revolution of society? So it can take that on. And it did back then, because preaching kindness did not get Jesus killed. You know, preaching everybody love one another did not get Jesus killed. That's not what scared empire. The religious elite and the political elite, they definitely saw a lot of what Jesus said as kind of sedition, as revolutionary. And even today, people talk like that. And you get criticisms of, well, you're trying to remake society. That's too political or whatever. And that's where it's always interesting. Jesus talks a whole lot about society and how we are to live with each other. And that's what politics is. Politics is literally, in the Latin, life of the city. How you live in the city together. That was one of God's main concerns. How do we live together in this world? And ultimately, if you really get down to it, that's what politics is about too. Trying to decide how we live together in this world through laws, through programs, through ventures, all of it is supposed to help us figure out how to live well together. And so you may have different versions of talking about it, but ultimately the gospel has a whole lot of righteousness, right relationships. And a lot of times politics tries to govern right relationship twos with varying degrees of success and differing ideas of whether those values are right or not. Good question. Other questions? All right, see you next week.